As we begin to consider the future of the U.S. role in the Middle East, we have to reckon with where the Obama administration began. And there are some that would say that President Obama's foreign policy agenda was in fact largely set by the need to deal with what he inherited from his predecessor. Others hailed him as a leader who would transform America's relationships in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. And in fact, it was at this forum, at the U.S. Islamic World Forum in 2009, that President Obama announced his special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Rashad Hussain, who is with us today. But whether your expectations for American foreign policy were grand or modest, it's clear that, as Ambassador Patterson told us, here in 2014, we are at a time of transition. The United States has ended its military engagement in Iraq, is winding down its engagement in Afghanistan, and with that, ending a long period, really dating back in some ways to the late 1980s, of relatively high military presence in the broader Middle East. The Arab world, of course, is in the midst of its own transition, driven by demands, frustrations, and aspirations amongst its rising generation of young people. In some cases, we see great promise, and in others, we see brutal and violent actors that have taken the field. And the Middle East, of course, is a historic crossroads, but in the modern era, it's a key source of energy for the global economy. But today, more of this region's energy is shipping to Asia, and the United States may soon stop importing oil altogether. So these transformations necessitate changes in government policies and approaches, and we have a wonderful panel to help us think through what this means. Starting to my immediate left, Dr. Phil Gordon, Special Assistant to the President and the White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf. On the far end is Sander Al-Amrani, the International Crisis Group's Project Director for North Africa and a keen observer of both Arab politics and Western foreign policy. To his right, Bruce Rydell, a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Director of our Intelligence Initiative, who led President Obama's 2009 Afghanistan policy review. And he is, of course, part of the steering committee for the U.S. Islamic World Forum, as is Shibli Telhami, to his right, who is also the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and I'm very proud to say, a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And finally, Hisham Melhem, a leading Arab journalist and the Washington bureau chief for Al Arabiya News, I believe the first Arab journalist to interview President Obama after he came in office. Is that right?
I hope they don't write that on my tombstone.
So we'll have a bit of a conversation up here amongst the group and then open it up to all of you. We look forward to your participation. And for those of you watching via webcast or following us on Twitter, feel free to tweet in your thoughts as well. We look forward to those. So Phil, if I can start with you, we've talked a lot about the President's West Point speech. It's come up again and again since we started this morning. But I'm thinking of a speech that President Obama gave last fall at the United Nations. He identified there 3 top priorities for the U.S. in the Middle East: negotiations with Iran, Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and negotiations to end the Syrian conflict. Last week at West Point, he didn't even mention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the speech seemed focused on threats from Iran, threats from terrorism. Now, some would see this as America losing ambition, narrowing its focus, walking away from the Middle East and looking elsewhere. Is the American view of the region shrinking in response to growing demands from elsewhere? Or is there a broader vision of the kind of Middle East America wants to see?
Thanks very much, Tammy, for that opportunity to answer that question. Let me actually begin by thanking not just you, but our hosts here, the government of Qatar, for sponsoring this forum. You know, I had the privilege of participating in some of the early forums in the early 2000s in a different capacity, and it's a pleasure to be back and to see it thriving more than a decade later. I think you could argue, given developments over the past couple of years, months, or even days, it's as important as ever to have a dialogue like this. Where your specific question is concerned about the future of the U.S. in the region, I would refer you not just to the speeches you mentioned, but actually to the totality of what the President, the administration have said about this issue, but even more importantly, to what we are doing. And I think if you look at that totality of words and action, it sort of rebuts the notion, I would even say the caricature, of a United States that is moving away from the region. So take, as you say, not just the West Point speech, but actually the General Assembly speech from last fall, which I think you're right to point to if we're here talking about the Middle East. And in a way, that speech itself, the fact that about 80% of that speech, I think, was about the Middle East in a General Assembly speech, in itself is a sort of rebuttal to the notion that we've moved on, we've pivoted to other regions, and we're not paying attention to this one. More importantly, though, I think if you look at the content of that speech, you talked about some of the diplomatic priorities that were mentioned in it, but I would remind you that also in the speech was the President's identification of our core interests in the region. I think that's worth thinking a little bit about. What did the President say? He said the United States is prepared to use all of the elements of our power, including military force, including, if necessary, unilateral military force, to ensure these core interests. And he mentioned them as including the defense of our friends and allies against external aggression, the free flow of energy out of the region, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the prevention of terrorist safe havens. The United States will use all of its power, including military power, including unilaterally, to defend these core interests. So that in and of itself is a pretty significant statement of interest and engagement in the region. He went on to say that we have other interests in the region, which include development of democracy, which include human rights, which include human development and education. And these are also very important to the United States. They're more likely issues we will work with others multilaterally to advance, and we won't necessarily and can't necessarily use our military power to ensure them, but they're also important to the United States. So I think that is a good frame for how we're thinking about the region. And as I say, it's not just a good frame, but it pushes back on the idea that somehow we don't recognize the importance of our core interests here. In terms of what we're doing, and I'll promise to be brief, and I'm sure you'll come back to all of these things, but just to say behind those words, I think are deeds that also rebut the caricature of moving away from the region. It's already been reminded that we have some 35,000 troops which back up this identification of core interests. The United States remains the major military power, and we have the wherewithal to defend the core interests that the President identified. If you compare that to having 150,000 troops in Iraq, okay, if that's your standard, maybe that's less. But by any normal standard, it's a recognition of a real interest and ability to back it up. Our relations with the GCC that Assistant Secretary Patterson referred to, whether it's our diplomatic cooperation or our defense presence or defense sales or missile defense and air defense, that's a big recognition of it. I will not here go through all of the diplomatic engagements, but what we're doing on Iran as we speak, with a senior delegation meeting directly with the Iranians to build an international coalition to deal with the nuclear agenda. It's already been referenced, Secretary Kerry's investment in the Middle East peace process, what we've done on Egypt over the past year as a recognition of the importance of that strategic partnership, but also our interest in a inclusive, sustainable democracy in Egypt. I'm sure we will come back to Syria. The point is, if you look at this diplomatic agenda and our presence and what we have said, I really do think it puts paid to the notion that we've turned our attention elsewhere.
Okay, thanks, Phil, and we'll certainly come back to the fruits of those efforts and where we might go from here on things like the peace process or Iran. But Bruce, let me turn to you, if I may. As somebody who has focused so much over a long career on the threats that terrorism poses to American interests and to American partners in this part of the world, the president said the threats have changed, that the threat of terrorism has evolved, and that the U.S. needs to change its approach in response. The war on terror is a phrase he'd like to put to bed. At the same time, we have things like the crisis in Crimea that really highlight that we've reached the end of a post-Cold War era, if you will, in relationships between the great powers, and we may now be entering an era of greater competition or even conflict between the U.S. and Russia, between China and American partners in East Asia, and that necessarily changes America's foreign policy focus. What do these kinds of changes mean for the Middle East?
Thank you, Tammy. I think you're right. We face, at the same moment as we are moving from an era of a very, very large American military footprint, 35,000 is large, but compared to where we've been over the last quarter century, it is significantly different from the 500,000 we had in 1991 in the region, 150,000 in Iraq, 100,000 more in Afghanistan. At the same time as that's going on, the threat environment, I would argue, is changing profoundly in at least two ways, and I just want to speak to both of them for a minute. One is the terrorism issue. You know, a couple of years ago, we were being told that the defeat of al-Qaeda, the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda, was in sight. That was premature. We'd heard it before. It was always premature. What in fact we've seen is al-Qaeda being outflanked now by even more violent extremist movements. I characterize it as the ghost of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the man who created al-Qaeda in Iraq, is now haunting the Islamic world with his extreme violence, extreme sectarianism that makes the mainstream of al-Qaeda look rather tepid in comparison, not to say that they aren't still dangerous as well. We heard from the president of Mali about what this kind of extreme sectarian, extreme Islamic practice did to his country in 2012. We see what it's doing in Nigeria through Boko Haram today. We know that the most popular individual for those kind of terrorists today is in fact Mr. Zarqawi. They emulate him. In Iraq, in Syria, we're seeing literally his creation, the Islamic State of Iraq, now named Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams, recurring and creating, as Ambassador Patterson created, an attempt at a caliphate across the eastern deserts of Syria and Iraq. Do we have a strategy that is going to be able to counter the narrative of this extremism? The Arab Spring has in fact, while it has played out, strengthened the narrative of these extremism by appearing to take the argument that the alternatives, moderation, elections, demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, don't work. That Twitter's fine, but in the end, it's force and violence that seems to make the change. Do we have a strategy now that is going to be successful in fighting this new, even more virulent kind of Islamic extremism than we've seen before? On top of which, whether we like it or not, we have to recognize that the fact that the United States is leaving Iraq and Afghanistan, and these violent extremists will remain in both of those places, will superficially, to a lot of people in this region, look like they won, we lost, and came home. I don't think that's the truth, but I can see how that historical narrative is now going to be put forward. The second big change in the threat environment is that the era in which big power politics was largely off the table, that appeared to begin in 1989 with the defeat of the Soviet 40th Red Army in Afghanistan, appears to be coming to an end in 2014, exactly a quarter of a century later. We've had the luxury as Americans, In fact, the world has had the luxury of not having to do with great power rivalries. With a few exceptions, mostly in the Balkans, we haven't seen the great powers of the world line up on opposite sides. The events in the Crimea, events in the South China Sea, seem to argue that that era is coming to an end, and that we're going to be living in an era in which big power politics are much more important than they've been before. We may see a world more polarized. We're also seeing nationalist parties come to power in very important countries like India and Japan. How are they going to play a role in this new, more polarized, but also more interactive, more rivalry situation? What does that mean for the Middle East? It means the amount of time that presidents in the Oval Office have to devote to the issues of the Middle East is likely to become less. If you're dealing with the future of Eastern Europe and the future of NATO, if you're dealing with the future of the balance of power in East Asia, if you're dealing with the rise of nationalist parties around the world, how much time are you going to be able to devote to issues in the Middle East? Now, Phil tells us that we're going to continue to be there, and I don't doubt that we will, but we're going to have major other distractions out there. Second impact. We've had the luxury of having some unity in the P5 over the last quarter of a century on major issues. Is that going to survive a major clash of interests between the United States and Russia over the Crimea? In particular, are we going to be able to maintain P5+1 unity on the Iranian issue when the Russians begin to look for new allies and new places to find ways to stick it to the Americans in the future? In short, the threat environment that we face today is rapidly evolving at the same time as the United States is repositioning itself in the Middle East and South Asia. And that's a pretty ripe situation for the unexpected and the unpredicted to come forward.
Bruce, thank you. So we've heard from Phil that the U.S. is not abandoning this region, but in fact is deeply invested in it. We've heard from Bruce that there are other demands and priorities pulling the United States' attention away from the Middle East. And so perhaps in practice, a bit of a mixed message to audiences in the region. Hisham, I want to ask you whether there aren't mixed messages on the Middle Eastern side of this equation as well. We have some here who would say that the United States should let the region determine its own future and quit being so heavy-handed, quit dictating. We have others who are demanding more American engagement on their side of some of these regional arguments. So what does the Middle East want from the United States in this next phase?
The paradox in the way most Arabs deal with the United States is that on the one hand, publicly they decry American intervention in their own affairs. On the other, when they approach the United States, they want the United States to be involved in internal Arab affairs, but to help their own side in these ongoing conflicts, in whether we're talking about Egypt or other places. There's a problem in that approach, obviously. And now the United States is dealing with an extremely evolving region, evolving in different ways. It is extremely difficult, even in normal times, to deal with such a complex region. We don't call it the Arab world for nothing. It is a world with its own contradictions, its own dynamics, and its own subgroups. But this is the first time in history where we see ourselves dealing with Sunni Shia bloodletting, not schism, not tensions, bloodletting on one continuum front, from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, and occasionally you can throw in Bahrain and Yemen. This is unprecedented in the modern history of the Arab world, this kind of violence. The other thing is, for the first time, we have three major Arab states that are in varying degrees of tumult. One of them is literally burning, Syria. The other one is on its way to another civil war, Iraq. The third one is Egypt, which has marginalized itself in the last 15 years, 20 years. And the sad part is that many Egyptians still talk about Egypt today as the Markaz, the center of the Arab world, which is not the case. So that, again, creates a lot of problems in the Arab world. So there is a dearth of leadership in the Arab world. What makes it also difficult is that there is a dearth of leadership in Europe, with the exception of Merkel, and which necessitated the issue of, or brought to the fore, the issue of American leadership. And here there's a problem. There's a perception in the Arab world, and there's a perception in other parts of the world, that the United States is retreating from the world. Now, of course, I agree. The United States has a high military profile in the region, 35,000 troops and all that. But the way the President of the United States handled the issues in the Middle East, beginning with his major speech and his soaring rhetoric in Cairo, about the new page and new relationship with the Muslim world, the President did not really do a lot of follow-up on this. Then when the President promised us in the beginning of his first term that he will work very hard in his first term on the Arab-Israeli resolution, he appointed George Mitchell and all that. And again, when he met an immovable object named Benjamin Netanyahu, he flinched. And then we've seen his episodic involvement in the Arab uprisings. I never called them the Arab Spring. I never believed in that. And then Syria became the real test for his leadership. And on Syria, I have to give him C-, if not worse. On Syria, the President of the United States, on his own, called on Bashar al-Assad early on to step down. Of course, Bashar ignored it. Then, on his own, apparently, he came up with his famous or infamous by now red line. And then last summer, I thought, I've never seen a performance like this, to be blunt about it. The President of the United States issues a declaration that he's going to punish Syria militarily. And then Vladimir Putin threw him a lifeline, and then we ended up with an agreement on the chemical arsenal, which made it clear for the Syrians and everybody in the region that the United States is first and foremost interested in eliminating the CW arsenal from Syria, but not necessarily realizing that most of the victims were killed by conventional, ugly, primitive means such as the barrel bombings. I think Syria really damaged the credibility of the President of the United States. Now, maybe the United States is not retreating, but the perception that the United States is retreating is correct. The President of the United States kept talking about nation building at home, talking about coming home, again, which strengthened this perception that there is a retreat. And finally, again, I go back to Syria because it was so damaging. In the Arab world, we say, you don't unsheath your sword unless you intend to use it. As Robert Gates told us, he told the President of the United States, when you cock that gun, you better use it, or else don't do it. And I think the President really, his reputation is in jeopardy. The other thing I would add quickly, I've never seen Arab officials, including Gulf officials, allies with the United States, criticize the President privately in ways that I have never heard in my lifetime as a professional reporter covering Washington and U.S. Arab relationship in 35 years. This is really a problem. Again, I don't think that there is an overarching strategy or vision as to how to deal with this region. And as I said, even in the best of times, it is difficult to develop such one. Okay. But now that there is this hunger for international leadership, because there is none locally and regionally or in Europe, that's why the focus is on Barack Obama, and I think it's a justified focus. And I'll promise this is my last point. I fully agree with Phil and with Anne. There is no replacement for the United States in the Middle East. If we're talking about the future of the United States in the Middle East, the United States will remain the indispensable power in this area, whether people like it or not. So I'm not, I just want to make that very clear. China's not going to replace us here. Russia cannot replace us here. At best, there are still regional powers, and there's no regional power here, including Iran, that can play that role, which makes it more important than ever for the United States to deliver as the indispensable country, whether people like it or not.
So I find this very striking because you're saying a dearth of leadership in the region, in essence, has created a demand for leadership from Washington. Right. And yet the errors that you point to in the administration's approach are errors of raising expectations and not meeting them. They're errors of trying and not succeeding in the face of a region that is riven by sectarian strife, where major states are in turmoil. It sounded to me actually like any American president looking at a region in that state would wonder, what can we do that would make a positive difference if that's the state of affairs in the region itself? So a demand for leadership, but leadership to do what? To achieve what? What's achievable? And in that regard, I want to turn to Shibli and then to Isander. Shibli, you've done so much work on public opinion, both here in the region about the United States and amongst Americans about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. A lot of people would say that the speech the president gave last week with this more modest, if you will, vision is a speech the American public wants. That they look at a region riven by sectarian strife and states in turmoil and they say, don't go there.
Well, let me start with the public opinion part that you talked about. Anyway, connected is okay. And connected to also what Hisham said about the divisions in the Arab world. I mean, when you compare, for example, what Arabs want to see of America, we have to keep in mind that we have a polarized Arab world on a scale we had not seen before. And so this is actually a moment, in some ways, the reason why you see all these contradictions is that this is almost a zero-sum in the Arab context. You're either our friends or else you're our enemy in the context of the divisions that we have. This is not the moment for America. We've in a way, gone beyond that after the Bush years of if you're not our friend, you're our enemy, and we don't want to take bloody sides in the same way. Now, with public opinion, actually, public opinion has remained somewhat harmonious on some of the key issues. For example, even on Syria, where you might have the overwhelming majority of the Arab world really against the Assad regime, you still have majorities not wanting the U.S. to intervene. They don't see the U.S. as the answer. Where you're going to find the division is more among Arab rulers, not on the public level. And Arab rulers, even those who are allies of each other, are divided on this. I'll give you one example, particularly if you take Saudi Arabia and Egypt, two countries who today, particularly after President Morsi was sworn in, are President Sisi sworn in. Sorry about that. You have obviously a close alliance of the two countries, and yet they don't see eye to eye on Syria, and they don't see eye to eye on what the U.S. should be doing on Syria. So there's a divide on that. But I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the transformation that has taken both in terms of public attitudes and in terms of America's relations with the Middle East is really because of three big things that have happened. One is, you know, we're coming off, we meaning the U.S. in the Middle East, coming off two exceptional decades, really unprecedented decades. One decade, which is the 90s, in which the U.S. emerged as the dominant power in the world, perhaps in an unprecedented way historically. And that played itself immediately in the Middle East, in the coalition that the U.S. assembled for the 91 war. That's really the one that sort of set the U.S. up for a decade of dominance in the Middle East. A lot of expectations that the answers are to be found in the United States. The mediation effort on the Israel-Palestine question, the raised expectation we're going to have an end to that conflict by the end of the decade, followed by a decade of war, mostly focused on the Middle East. And war focuses the mind in ways that nothing else could. And therefore, there was certain expectations that that obsession of America with the Middle East that came out of the war would continue even after we pulled out of the Iraq war. Certainly that's not the case. But then when you add how this decade began, which is the Arab uprising, something indigenous that is transforming society and politics in the Middle East, changing expectations, I think in some ways in the short term, there is nothing the U.S. can do to win Arab public opinion. And for somebody who does public opinion poll, I would say, if you're doing your strategy in the short to medium term, don't pay too much attention to public opinion. Not because it doesn't matter, but that there's nothing you can do in the short term to win it. In the long term, you might, the reason for it is that the public has made up its mind that they don't trust America's intentions, and that's based on a history. It's based on a history and big-ticket items, like the Israel-Palestine question, the Gulf region. All of those things are not going to be addressed in the short term. And therefore, whatever we do, is the U.S. is going to be blamed. You see the Muslim Brotherhood blames the U.S. for supporting Sisi. Sisi blames the U.S. for supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. We're going to be trapped in that. And therefore, what we need to do is think about how we can create a strategic transformation. And with all of the talk about pivot to Asia, look at how obsessed we have been in terms of diplomatic effort in the Middle East. I think that's likely to continue, and it's likely to continue no matter what happens with the Iranian issue. If there's an agreement, there will be a lot of suspicion, and therefore the U.S. will be there. If there is no agreement, obviously the U.S. will be there.
Thanks, Shibli. Well, Sandar, you were in Tunisia during its uprising. You were in Egypt during its uprising. You spent a lot of time talking to the rising generation, talking to activists who are working to transform their societies. Is Shibli right? Is there nothing that the United States can do to support the aspirations of this majority of the Arab world? What do young people want from the United States, or do they just want the United States to be out of their hair?
It's a tough question to answer because you're asking me to speak on behalf of a whole lot of people who have divergent views. The entire region is polarized. There's a lot of different views. My takeaway from the last 3 years is that there's a gradual acceptance. When you came from a point where the U.S. had this domineering role in the region, there's a gradual acceptance, especially among younger people in the Arab world, that is fading. But the image of both the Cold War era and then the post-Cold War 1990s, 2000s era of this dominant role by the United States still plays there. And there's a bit of a schizophrenic, I think, attitude. You see that very clearly in Egypt in the example that you mentioned with regards, the U.S. loses every which way. You see it, I think, most strikingly on Syria, where the feeling that's expressed is, damn the U.S. for not helping us by the Syrian opposition. So it's hostility, but at the same time as a cry for help. I think, though, if you look back at the last 3 years, it's partly the result of a hesitant policy by the United States to the developments in the Arab Springs, a very, very cautious policy. I would argue that it was this historic opportunity. These opportunities don't come along that often. This is a transformational moment for the entire region, one that started on the path in 2011, and I think one of the reasons it's going perhaps in a fairly negative direction right now is perhaps because there was not enough U.S. involvement. In a way, the Arabs chose a terrible time to have revolutions. They chose it, in the middle of an economic crisis. They chose it to do so at a time where the United States, after very costly wars, was looking inwards. And the reality is the United States is a military power in the region, it's a political power in the region. I think especially the political withdrawal, especially at crucial times, because we really went through a number of events. I think Mohamed Morsi's November 2012 constitutional declaration was one of them, where a stronger push by the U.S., by other Western parties, the international community, could have made a difference and could have avoided a lot of trouble down the line. And I'm always struck when I go to Washington. There's a certain despondency. There's a sense that, oh, we can't do anything anyway. And I don't think that's true. I think clearly there's an expectation, and there's a symbolic value beyond the actual, whether you engage militarily, whether you impose sanctions or cut arm aid, military aid. And so there's a symbolic power that's underutilized, especially by this administration, and it's created this kind of cognitive dissonance, the expectations gap that you mentioned earlier, where and I think President Obama has a tendency, the way I see it, is to give one speech that's short and to the point, and that's quite appreciated. For instance, the Ankara speech in 2009, followed by a speech that goes overboard in its expectations and then fails to deliver, like the Cairo 2009 speech. One might make the same comparison between the UN GA speech last year and the recent West Point speech. They're the same topics, and one is very clear and to the point. One is perhaps overambitious and unrealistic.
So inconsistency, you would say, is the heart of the issue. I guess, and Phil, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of what you've heard here, but In many ways, the UN General Assembly speech with these 3 big diplomatic initiatives was incredibly ambitious. Well, we're going to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians, we're going to bring an end to the Syrian war through diplomacy, and we're going to get a historic nuclear breakthrough with the Iranians. It begs the question, and there's no doubt that any, but certainly all 3 of those, if achieved, would have a transformative effect on security and stability in this region and on U.S. relations in this region. And yet, you can never guarantee the success of any international negotiation, and we've already seen, just in the 9 months since that speech, the Syrian diplomatic process crash and burn, and the Israeli-Palestinian process on pause, at least, if not more. So what's the alternative for the United States if it can't use that diplomatic muscle to make transformative change in its relations with the region?
So look, Tim, I'll be the first to acknowledge the degree of complexity in the region and the challenges that we face that we don't pretend for a minute to have simple answers to. And I don't think, even in the Unga speech, when the president talked about diplomatic priorities, that he promised to bring these to fruition. What he promised to do is put our weight behind it because we have an interest in those things. I want to come back to a couple of things that were said on all of these topics, starting with Hisham's perception of the U.S. turning away. I agree, I accept there is that perception in the region. Indeed, that's why I brought it up, because I think it can easily be exaggerated. There's no question there's a perception, because it is fair to say Americans are tired after a decade of engagement abroad, and these engagements, especially militarily, are not popular, that there are budgetary pressures not to overspend in this region, that there are, as Bruce pointed out, other demands around the world, especially now with Russia, Ukraine added to what was already a hugely challenging agenda. So it is understandable that people are questioning the degree of commitment and whether the United States is not oriented elsewhere. But I wanted to push back against that because I think it's wrong. I also think it's wrong to use as a standard, Bruce, the 500,000 troops that we had in the first Gulf War or the 150,000 we had in Iraq. Yes, if that is your standard, that we have 250,000 troops deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan and we're spending $1 trillion in each place, if that's your standard, I admit we're not going to meet that bar. And if people are going to be disappointed in that, there's not a lot we can do about it because I don't think that's a realistic standard. The realistic standard is, will we put the resources behind our core interests and our diplomatic agenda? And that's what I was trying to suggest that we're doing. Just briefly on Syria. I will also be the first to acknowledge that the situation in Syria is deplorable. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that anyone is satisfied with the outcomes there. The president is certainly not satisfied. The consequences of the conflict that's going on there, obviously first and foremost in humanitarian terms, but in strategic terms for the neighbors, are devastating. And that's why the president is constantly tasking us to look at this again, ask what we can possibly do to bring this conflict to an end. I would, though, Hisham, push back on a couple of the criticisms that you raised. On the president's comments early on that Assad must go, what would you have had him said otherwise? I mean, I don't think that Assad must go meant, and therefore the United States is going to be willing to X, Y, and Z, and we can discuss what that might have been. Would it really have been sustainable? Are you suggesting that he could have taken an approach, well, notwithstanding what's going on, it's not up to us to reach a judgment on this leader? What the president was saying was clearly this leader had lost all legitimacy and support, and there can only be a stable Syria if he gets out of the way. That's what he said then, that's what we continue to believe now, but I don't think it meant then, and it doesn't mean now, that we would be willing to do some of what is sometimes suggested to achieve that goal. I would also respond to Hisham's comments about the chemical weapons issue and the red line. There too, I think we've actually been consistent. I know there's all this talk about walking away from the red line. The president said, even though we might not have a rapid and ready solution to deal with all of the other means that Assad is using to kill his own people, he said that violating this international norm would be unacceptable to us and might change his calculus. Well, there were reports of chemical weapons use throughout the year, but then on August 21st last year, there was a clear and significant use that killed more than 1,000 people. And the president said, that's what I meant by a red line, and that's not acceptable to the United States, and he prepared a significant military action to deal with it. Then we saw two things. One, the American public in Congress was, let me say, not particularly enthusiastic about supporting that use of force. So we can debate whether the president should have gone to Congress. He felt it was important to get democratic legitimacy behind something that wasn't going to be easy. We could do the military strike, but what would come after that? And would people start questioning it? And Congress insisting, we want a voice. You can't do this without it. You don't have the constitutional authority. So he asked Congress, and the response from Congress and the American public was overwhelmingly, we don't want you to get involved in that way. But then the outcome, which you criticized implicitly, was an agreement to actually get rid of the entire chemical weapons arsenal that we have now almost completed. So until August of last summer, Assad not only had one of the largest chemical stocks in the world, but was using it on an increased basis. And now he's not only not using it, he doesn't even have it. We're 92% of the way there, and we're determined to get 100% of the way there. So there, too, I'm not so sure it's right. I realize that's the perception, but I don't think it's right to suggest somehow that the president drew a red line and then casually walked away from it. On the contrary, we've actually achieved the goal. Last point, because like I said, I've acknowledged that what we're doing is not enough. We need to do more. We're constantly asking what we can do. Even though there is not a lot of public support behind more and more involvement in Syria, and even though we don't believe there's a simple solution, I should add, by the way, I'll permit one other sort of reference here without, I referred, Tammy, earlier to participation in the forum earlier, and I recall 2002, the huge debate and the huge criticism of the American administration then was passively standing by and leaving Saddam in power. Again, it was sort of assumed this American deus ex machina. How can you, the American officials had to listen, how can you tolerate this dictator? He's been for a decade. The sanctions are hurting the people. There's a no-fly zone. It's not accomplishing anything. You need to do more. You need to do more. Well, then the U.S. administration at the time ultimately concluded the only option was to use military force. They did it, and lo and behold, at the forum the following year, they weren't particularly popular for that. Now, we don't have to rehearse the Gulf War, but my point is simply that it's easy to somehow imply that the Americans can or should deal with the situation, whatever it takes, but sometimes the costs and consequences of doing that are not necessarily what people had in mind in the first place.
Well, thank you, and I think that takes us back to two things that were raised earlier. One is the gap between governments in the region and peoples in the region. Perhaps only on the Syrian issue do they agree in terms of what the U.S. role should be, which is more. But on everything else, there seems to be quite a gap. And also, even amongst governments in the region, some mixed messages or some different interests, perhaps, in terms of how they would like to see the United States engage. So I want to come back to Hisham, if I can, to ask how can the United States navigate a region that is in this much flux with this much division?
By sticking to some core principles, but let me quickly, I don't want to have this engagement with my friend Phil on this issue. The issue boils down to leadership. The issue boils down to leadership. And I think the president is dealing with Syria proved that he was very inconsistent on this issue. Look, Barack Obama is not Hisham Malhem. I could say Assad should go, but the president of the greatest power on earth, when he says he should go, he should have said or else. Or else was implicit, or should have been implicit. Then the red line was a major commitment. And I think still, I believe that he didn't deliver on that. Again, it's a question of leadership. If the president addressed the American people, and you know that Phil very well, he could have laid out a case, logically, clearly, that it serves the United States' interests in the region. We cannot allow Syria to burn because Syria will burn the whole region. And I know from the beginning, people said we have no strategic interest in Syria, and I fully agree with that. But the United States has strategic interest in the 5 states around Syria. 4 of them have been traditional allies: Turkey, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. And in Iraq, we lost 35,000 casualties between dead and wounded. We spent $1.5 trillion. Iraq now is descending to hell, in part because of what's happening in Syria. It was in that, there was a failure, American failure, in grasping what Syria meant to the region. So the issue of leadership, he could have approached the American people and told them, I need to do these things. American president always shape the debate in the United States, not only the Congress. And I think he had cold feet after Cameron did not get the support from his own parliament, and then he decided to go to Congress. Legally, the president of the United States had absolutely all legal rights to go and strike Assad. And then we had the Secretary of State of the United States of America telling us that the attack is going to be, quote unquote, unbelievably small. The same Secretary of State went to Beirut last week and he was pleading, and I underline the word pleading, imploring, beseeching Hezbollah and Iran to be cooperative in Syria at a time when Hezbollah and Iran and Syria believe that they are winning on the ground. It is baffling. You know,
Hisham, as I said, we got rid of the chemical weapons, but on the or else.
He's using chlorine now.
What would you have him do as the or else? If the president followed your advice, I mean, he would have had two choices. One is not to say Assad must go. And in that case, I suspect if we were sitting here in 2014, you'd be leading the charge of saying, how can the United States not have said Assad must go? Or else, if he said that, what would you have him do if Assad didn't go after he said or else?
Well, and I have to wonder, given the dynamics that both Bruce and Assander raised, whether if the United States had intervened in Syria early on in the conflict to follow up on that implicit or else, would we see today the same degree of jihadi threats, perhaps, but driven by that American intervention? Would we see demonstrations across the Arab world directed against American intervention?
Phil helpfully reminds us that the big footprint wasn't that popular when it was here in the past. I think he also makes a very important point that is very important for our Islamic world audience to hear. The American people have looked at the big footprint and come to the conclusion it's too expensive. We heard the figure $1.2 billion for the two wars. The actual number is more in the area of $4 billion, which even for the American economy, $4 trillion, $4 trillion, even for the American economy is staggering. The kind of unwillingness to do something in Syria that Phil reminds us of from last August is very deeply rooted. The president in his own party is not being attacked for leaving Afghanistan prematurely. He's being attacked for staying as long as he is, when almost all of his expert advisors are saying that he is withdrawing too quickly and at too precipitous a rate. He doesn't have a lot of choice. Politics in the United States is like politics in the rest of the world. It's all about what your domestic constituency is willing to do. And the American domestic constituency is not eager, not interested in large footprints, grandiose adventures in the Middle East anymore. It wants to see a much more reduced American presence. We have a president who is now in his twilight days. He is likely to take a real wallop this fall. There's a very good chance he's going to lose control of the Senate. He's going to find his political powers increasingly constrained by all of these domestic political factors. And the thing that is important to note when you look at American politics today, he's not facing domestic rivals, by and large, who are crying out to do more, send troops, put in more investment. His Republican opponents, with a few exceptions, most of whom are people we've seen around for a long, long time, but his younger Republican opponents are the ones who are just as risk-averse, just as adventure-averse. They might not have a solution, but the solution they're advocating is rarely, let's send in American troops. So I think Phil is right when he says the 250,000 is no longer the benchmark. Absolutely. I'm not sure 35,000 is going to be a benchmark that is sustainable in terms of American domestic political constituencies over the future, barring a major terrorist attack on the United States homeland that creates a new national trauma.
Thank you. Shibli, quickly, and then I'm going to take it to the audience for Q&A.
Well, I just want to add even beyond. I mean, let's obviously the political issue for the president is important and central, but it's even beyond that. I mean, if you look at it strategically, first of all, had the U.S. intervened in Syria, even for moral reasons, just for humanitarian reasons, I bet you the press would be seeing some other reasoning for America. The Arab press would see in it imperialistic designs the next morning. Even some of those people were calling for intervention. But strategically, I think personally, the President of the United States, I disagree with a lot of policies, but on this one issue of resisting the temptation to intervene and disentangling America from disastrous wars, he is doing the biggest favor to the next president. He's not weakening America, he's preserving the power of America. When we look at the intervention strategically, even a small-scale intervention, the slippery slope of escalation, the idea of protecting credibility, what it has done in the past to the U.S., not just to look at the Iraq case, I think there was a lot of reasons for him to pursue the policy that he's pursuing. And I think as a consequence of that, the next president of the United States, whoever that may be, is going to have far more options, including intervention options, than this president has at the moment.
Thank you. Well, Shibli, it's a great note to open up our discussion on, because it really suggests that one way or another, this region and other regions of the world are going to have to figure out how to prioritize their asks, if you will, from any American administration, whether it's this one or the next one, and they're going to have to therefore work a lot harder on how to deal with regional security issues on their own. I would like to open it up to the audience at this point. Let me just lay out the ground rules, and first of all, tell you we're going to go until 1:30 to make sure we have time for this discussion. First of all, if you get the mic, state your name and where you're from, and please keep your question, and I'd like it to be a question, brief, so that we can have as many people as possible participate. The lights are a little hard for me here, but I think we'll start right here in the front row, and we'll take several of you before we come back to the panel. So, and if you can, please direct your question to a particular panelist.
Thank you very much. My name is Josh Rogan. I'm a reporter with the Daily Beast in Washington, D.C. My question is for Phil Gordon. You talked about President Obama's speech at West Point, in which he pledged that the U.S. would ramp up its support to the moderate Syrian opposition. As you may know, this announcement was greeted by the leaders of that opposition with a measure of confusion and skepticism. Confusion because there were no details, and skepticism because, as they say, they've heard these promises before and don't feel that they've been delivered upon. My question to you is, if it's true, as U.S. officials say, that the only way to get to the political solution is to put pressure on the Assad regime so that they will feel compelled to enter that political process in good faith, is the U.S. committed to that, and does the U.S. plan to substantially increase its aid to the armed moderate opposition, or are we likely to see more of a mild increase in the aid that is unlikely to change the facts on the ground? Thank you.
Okay, Josh, and if you can just hand the mic to the gentleman 3 seats down from Pakistan.
My name is Shafkat Mahmood. I am from Pakistan. My question is both for Bruce and Phil. I'd just like to ask that in terms of the bulge, which is increasing amongst the fragile states as well as developing countries regarding radicalization, I feel the speed with which, or the rate with which it is increasing, we do not have the countermeasures which are being done to reduce that. I would like to know that Bruce has mentioned two of the major threats, and one is the terrorism. How U.S. is taking on the stance on reducing that bulge, which is increasing day by day, and especially amongst educated youth. They're also now becoming extremists. So on that account of what the policy is, firstly, and secondly, I would like to say that what Phil had mentioned, that in case of the public opinion, I think the public opinion matters a lot. There's a trust deficit amongst most of the states and the people regarding America. regarding US. So on that account, I think I would like to see that how US, as per policy, leaving aside that diplomatic support, leaving aside that support on economic grounds, what are other measures being taken to reduce that trust deficit between the states and people as well as US? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take one more here in the red shirt.
Thank you all. My name is Ramesh Srinivasan. I'm a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. And my question is, there are different surveys that tell different stories, but some that I've been reading say that the average or the median age in the Middle East and North Africa is 22. And so many of these individuals, as we've been alluding to, are disaffected, younger obviously. Some of them are very heavy social media users. And I want to talk, sort of independent of footprint issues, what are productive and constructive forms of engagement with what I see as the larger thrust of the issue, the larger group that really we want to speak about. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've really got a couple of questions that are looking beyond the security dimension of combating extremism and stabilizing the region, and looking at how the United States can reach out to a rising generation, rebuild its trust deficit, and go beyond a sort of threat-focused, if you will, approach. Shibli, you want to start?
Well, let me just start by saying, one of the interesting things about, you can ask what the U.S. can do without even improving its image. That's a separate issue, because the U.S. is still a superpower with a lot of capacities. But what could the U.S. do to improve its image beyond the security issue? And I think one of the things that we are not facing in some ways, we're only looking at the simple measures, which is people are angry with America. They still are. They were a decade ago. But the reality of it is the intensity of anger with America has gone down after we pulled out of Iraq. It's not as high. People, yes, if you ask them, what are your views of the U.S., they're still not positive, but that's not the focus of their attention, whether it's for Egyptians who are fighting their own battles, whether it's the Syrians, whether it's the Palestinians for that matter, whether it's the Saudis. And therefore, there's a lot of things that the U.S. can do because the security isn't the top priority issue for them. And that includes clearly a lot of the things that we see, particularly in the educational arena. I think that one of the things that, when we look at the space in the Arab world and what are the needs going to be? We're looking at the young people, the unemployment, but most of it is training of skills that are needed for jobs. America has a decisive edge globally on that. And there's a lot of need across the board for working with non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations, the sort of stuff that we need to spend far more time. Don't think of it as a short-term action to improve views of the United States. Think of it as a long-term investment, both in the stability of the region, but also in the relationship with the U.S.
Thanks, Shibli. Sandra, I have to ask you, if the United States were to invest more in scholarships and vocational training and addressing youth unemployment and building private sector jobs, is this something that you think would make a dent in attitudes toward the U.S., or conversely, would it get the U.S. in trouble because to do that, the United States would be engaging with society, with the business community, with civil society in ways that often get it into trouble with governments?
Well, my understanding is that the United States has been doing that for quite a while, actually, already, and with perhaps mixed success, with certainly some backlash in Egypt in 2012 especially. But I do think that if you see how it worked over the long term, it did pay off. I don't think that these initiatives are going to be enough, because at the end they're not that high profile, and they don't have the symbolic power. The reality is that we're dealing with a region that, as one of the persons who spoke out, is very young. We're dealing with a region in the middle of a generational clash. Some countries have gone through transitions where new generations have come to powers, others haven't. Even in the countries that are going, where the transitions are going relatively well, such as Tunisia, you see a lot of quite old leadership that are in many respects fighting old battles, not fighting the battles that are relevant to those people who are 22-year-old today. Now, these are domestic debates for these countries. Obviously, the United States has a limited ability to act there. But it does have an ability to act on some of the framing structural conflicts, the meta-narratives of the region. And I think the most striking right now is the polarization. Superficially, it's an Islamist secular polarization. I think it's a lot more complicated. It's a geopolitical polarization. And on both sides, you find U.S. allies. And the U.S. has not, apart from promoting the concept of inclusion, has not really taken a side. And I think at some points or on some issues, it will have to take a side.
Thank you, Bruce. And then we'll come back to Phil, and we'll see if we can take a couple more.
I just want to address the question about Pakistan that was put to me. The good news I want to report about President Obama is that he does live up to his commitments. At least he lived up to his commitment to me. He asked me to provide advice on Pakistan for 60 days, and at the end of 60 days, he let me go. So I don't have any responsibility to talk about American policy towards Pakistan today. And that's a good thing, because the trust deficit between America and Pakistan is really, it's not a deficit, it's a yawning gap. It makes the Grand Canyon look like a tiny little crack. It's so huge. And it goes two ways, and I think this is something that's important for people to understand. Polling consistently shows that America is the most unliked country in Pakistan today, regarded by more Pakistanis as the existential threat to their country than even India. And when you outpoll India as the bad guy in Pakistan, you have really reached a very deep, deep hole. But what I don't think is understood on the other side of the equation is that Pakistan has now moved in the American orbit into the place that Iraq used to hold as the third in the triptych of evil regimes: North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. I'll give you an example. Watch any movie in the United States, any TV show in the United States about terrorism, and as soon as the terrorist is identified, we learn where did they come from? They just came from a training base in Pakistan. That's not a very good image for Pakistanis to have. What can we do about it? Fulbright scholars, leadership programs, education, those are all good things. I'm in favor of them. But as you rightly point out, they were invented in 1946 and 1947 by the Truman administration. They're not exactly new news. The hard problem at the end of the day is to get back to the business of demonstrating that the United States is an advocate for justice, change, and peace in the Middle East and throughout the Islamic world. That's why I hope the pause turns out to be a pause, not a way of letting this issue slip away. In the case of India and Pakistan, we have perhaps a false dawn, but a dawn that we ought to explore in the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Sharif. That is something that we ought to look into, see if the United States can somehow help there. And on one big issue, which is sectarian conflict, I think the United States ought to take a very clear and decisive position. We are against the increasing sectarianism in the Middle East and throughout the Islamic world, including in Pakistan. We think this makes no sense. For Sunnis and Shias to be slaughtering each other in the ways they are doing today is not a sign of advancement in the Islamic world. It is a sign of retrograde. And the United States ought to be saying that, even though that's going to irritate greatly some of our own friends in the region.
Bruce, thank you. Hisham, I know you want to make a point, but I really do want to be able to get one or two more questions in if we can. So I'm going to let Phil answer the question asked to him, and then we'll come back to the audience. And I promise, whatever the question is, Hisham, you'll answer it.
Right, so I did have a specific question on the Syrian opposition. And yes, we are, in fact, committed to supporting the Syrian opposition and, as the President put it in his speech, ramping up that support. And that's because we have an interest in the development of a moderate Syrian opposition. For reasons I said before, we don't see any conceivable future stable Syria under Assad, and there needs to be a political transition, and it needs to be a political transition to a leadership that we can work with. And one of the constraints on our ability to support the opposition in ways we might like has been the extremist element in Syria, something we're very concerned about, something the President talked about in West Point, and that's why we're very specific to say when we talk about ramping up our support, it's for the moderate opposition. But we are not only ramping up now, but understand that the United States has been increasing its support to the moderate vetted opposition for some time. We've now provided nearly $300 million to that opposition, and that's obviously in addition to the more than $2 billion we provided for humanitarian relief. We acknowledge that's not enough. It comes in lots of forms, everything from food to medicine to trucks to support for local councils, because we want them to be able to deliver, want them to be able to deliver better than the extremists can. We've said that we have provided support to the SMC, the military council as well, without detailing the elements of that support. So it is something that we're committed to. Again, the President not only said that we're doing it and ramping it up, but he wants to work with Congress because obviously, and this is related to the discussion we've had before about support, we need congressional support to pursue this strategy.
Thank you. Let me turn back to the floor and I see a question on this side, the gentleman in the jacket with his hand up.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Just a quick point. President Obama
Just
did
let
mention...
us know who you are, please.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Osama Hassan from Quilliam in London. President Obama did mention in his Cairo speech that Shia and Sunni should close ranks. So way back, that was a very welcome comment he made. But just a very quick question. As we all know, the total population of the Arab world is about the same as the United States, 300 million people, roughly. And isn't it a slight concern if some of the politicians, Assistant Secretary of State, etc., speak almost in colonial terms about American objective, if you like, the benefits for the United States, and the fact that you even asked the question, Tamara, should the people of this region determine their own future? Well, of course they should. And we need to move towards a world of partnership and a coexistence of civilizations, which I'm sure is a win-win situation for everybody. It's not just the United States' interests that matter here or anywhere around the world. We need that freedom and democracy and self-determination of all nation states or peoples. And that's really the only way to solve long-term many of the conflicts that we're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, so as I understand, that was more of a statement than a question, but making the point that partnership means understanding the interests of the region as well, and that in order for those interests to be manifest, the 300 million people of the Arab world need freedom and democracy. Did I get that right?
Yeah, so, and therefore policies of in Egypt, for example, supporting a transition to power which involved massacres of people is going to cause many young people to be disillusioned, and it will continue the extremism, unfortunately, that leads to violence.
Gotcha. Okay, I think we have time for one more. There's a gentleman on the aisle, center aisle. Oh.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Vara, my question or comment is directed at Mr. Bruce Riedel. I appreciate the concern he has for the mutual lack of trust, Pakistan, US, but I just want to point out that there's a fundamental difference between North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. The polls you've cited can be very misleading. Unlike North Korea and Iran, Pakistanis predominantly patronize virtually every kind of multinational American entity, and they do extremely well in Pakistan. There are no attacks, even when times of great conflict on policy issues. So I would just urge you not to think of us as American haters. We respect America. We disagree on matters of policy, but there is no visceral hatred, a kind of congenital, paranoid hatred for America. It's just a disagreement on policy. And we are far more friendly towards America than polls would suggest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we'll take one last question over here in the front row.
Thank you. Hatun Al-Fasi, women's historian from Saudi Arabia. It's a general question to everybody. There is an agreement here that the United States is having a very bad poll on public opinion, and I think that I think all of you agree with me that part of it, in addition to its public policy and the policies in the Middle East, Syria, and the rest, I would add to it certain decisions that the United States takes in Yemen or in Pakistan with the assigned assassinations by all those airplanes without guidance. Such policies that the United States takes need to be raise the question as to who are actually the advisors in the United States or in Washington that suggest such things that they will solve something, that this will eliminate terrorism, that will that by killing every terrorist on earth we are solving the problem of the image of the United States as a just state or a caller for justice. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's an interesting question as we look ahead, and as the President emphasized, the evolution of the terrorist threats facing the United States and its allies in this region. Does that mean a proliferation of the kind of counterterrorism tactics that we've seen in, for example, Afghanistan and Pakistan? Are we going to see more drone strikes in the Middle East? And what does that mean for the way the United States is regarded in this region? So why don't we start with Hisham, as promised, and we'll wind up with Phil to give you the last word.
Okay, I just want to say a few things about the United States in the Middle East. Whatever the United States does in this part of the world, there will always be a strata of Arabs that would denounce it for one reason or another. So that should be a given. This comes with being a great power and a superpower. And I happen to believe that there are certain things only the United States can do or should do. And I do believe that the United States, on occasions, did intervene in places where the United States did not have any discernible national security interests. And I bring up Bosnia in particular, the Balkans in the 1990s, where to the ever shame of Europe, they allowed on the European soil mass killing of people just because of their religious and ethnic background for the first time since the Holocaust. And the great powers of Europe, old Europe, quote unquote, did nothing until the Americans intervened, and they intervened in an area, as I said, where they had no discernible strategic interest. So that should be a point where if I were an American official, I would always remind our friends in the so-called Muslim world of what we've done there, not to mention how we did to Kuwait or saving the Kurds and all that. There was a memo that was written in May of 1950, signed by Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State at that time. It was sent to the American embassies in the Middle East. The title was Rising Anti-Americanism in the Middle East, in which the Secretary tells his ambassadors in the region how to deal with this, these phenomena, this event, bombings of American positions, vitriolic attacks on America and the media and all that. So the reason I bring this up is that, folks, we have been there. Wake up, we have been there. So deal with this and focus on certain principles. We made a lot of mistakes in the Middle East, and I think the disaster of Iraq will be with us for a few decades to come, including in America, where me and my kids were going to pay, as we should, for those who were wounded severely in that war, and this is what I call the hidden cost of the war. So the legacy of Iraq will remain with us, and I think the retrenchment that Bruce was talking about too comes naturally after disastrous wars, and the history of the United States is full of those examples. So the United States will come back, so to speak, quote unquote. But in the region, I think the United States was never consistent in its approach to the region. We always valued our bilateral relationship with the despots that rule this part of the world and most of the Muslim world against the interest of the people. And we rarely been consistent about the issue of democracy and human rights, denouncing terror and denouncing a torture that takes place in most Arab countries and most Muslim countries. And the United States can use soft power, deal with NGOs, deal with the youth in the Arab world, deal with the business community, deal with those people who believe seriously that it's in their own intrinsic interest to have good relationship with the West in general, and particularly the United States. And I would care very little about public opinion at a given moment or time. Public opinion is fickle, and it can be influenced. And public opinion polls, with all due respect to opinion polls, and I'm talking about the opinion polls here, especially in this part of the world, they are still not the best way, best criteria, forgive me, Shibli, to measure public opinion. And public opinion can be swayed, and most Arabs still believe in conspiracy theories. So when we talk about public opinions, or the mood of the Arab street, quote unquote, by the way, something I detest fervently, as if the Arabs cannot express their opinions unless they go in the streets. We don't talk about public, the American street, or the French street, or the Venezuelan street. We talk about the Arab street, as if we have only Arabs shouting. But I think I would care a little bit about public opinion in the Arab world if I'm pursuing consistent policies that reflect American values. And this is the problem. George Bush gave a great speech. I didn't vote for George Bush, but George Bush gave a great speech, and then he destroyed it after that. In his second inaugural speech, when he said, for the first time, a sitting American president said to the American people, we blew it in the Middle East. Why? Because for the last 60 years, both Republican and Democratic administrations looked the other way when our friends in the Arab and the Muslim world were torturing their own people, humiliating their own people every day. And we did that in the name of maintaining security, the free flow of oil, and anti-Soviet alliances. And he said, no more of that. And then we had a series of elections. And then the administration was frightened because Hezbollah did well, because the Islamist groups did well in Iraq, and because Hamas took over and all that. And we believed naively, many people in the Middle East, just as in America, just as in the Middle East, believed naively until this moment that democracy is synonymous with elections. And we know how elections are influenced. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a series of elections in the Caucasus and Central Asia, and who won? The old regime won, the ancien regime won, because they know how to cajole, how to control, how to manipulate, how to threaten, and how to organize. And our people, the Democrats with small d, did not do well because we didn't help them that much. And I think we should make it a commitment, or an investment, if you like that, in the youth in the Arab world, in the business communities, those who are interested in good relationship with the United States and the West in general, and based on certain values. And I don't care if a given Arab tin-horn dictator doesn't like it or not. We had an example, that's my last, I promise. We had a long history of dealing with the Soviet Union, in which both Democratic and Republican presidents did the same, essentially. We dealt with the Soviet Union. We had that red line. We can talk to them once in a while. But we helped the dissident movement in the Soviet Union. We helped the Helsinki 75. We helped all the dissidents in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union while maintaining a relationship. There are Arab countries here and Muslim countries here who cannot do without the United States. When an Egyptian official tells you, we don't need American aid because we can go to the Russians, okay, who's going to pay for your weapons? And let them, they should be reminded also, it took them 25 years to move from Soviet Union weapon systems to the American weapon systems. There is this whole $1.5 billion. They don't understand it in Egypt, for instance. They believe that we can get money from the Gulf and other places and we can do whatever we want. That is not true. There are a lot of states in the Arab and the Muslim world who cannot do without the United States. And I think the United States, let's be blunt about this, should exploit that.
Thank you. I think we'll have to leave it there from Hisham. Others on the panel, closing remarks before I come back to Phil?
I just want to say just a couple of things. One is on, no matter what we say about what the plan for the Obama administration is or what we recommend for American foreign policy, just imagine that the negotiations with Iran fail tomorrow. What set of priorities are going to be on the table just as a result of that, including the possible use of force, if not directly by the U.S., by the Israelis, in a way that will entangle the U.S. Imagine that we have total disruption of the Israel-Palestine question. You have a new intifada, you have conflict, how that's going to draw the U.S. in. So we can talk about all of the things, the restraints that we have, but we have to remember that not only do we preempt the U.S. and will continue to do so here on the ground and reshape American priorities, but we also in America go through these cycles of interventionism and isolationism. And those cycles are not just a function of American weakness or American strength. They're actually a function of overuse of force and underuse of force. And we go through them. And we've gone through a period of overuse of force. We're looking back, we're setting back. So to expect that the next decade will look like this one will be a mistake.
Thank you. So even if you don't like U.S. foreign policy, you should hope it succeeds. Bruce.
I just want to come back to the concrete things that we can do in regard to the question about counterterrorism. One thing that's been missed by most people around the world is that American drone operations in Pakistan have largely ceased. There hasn't been a lethal drone operation in Pakistan now in this entire year, and we're into June. But that's a negative thing. There's a positive thing we could do, and we could use the help of the Islamic world in that. And that is in exposing these perpetrators of hate. Let me give you an example. The head of the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams, Mr. Baghdadi, he claims to be a descendant of the Prophet. He claims to be a theology expert. He claims to be an expert in Islamic law. I kind of seriously doubt he's any of those things, but I'd like to see my government, I'd like to see the Iraqi government put out who this guy really is. Where did he come from? What's his ideological core? Let's expose some of these people. The same thing with Boko Haram and with others. We unfortunately have not seen the war against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaedism in the same way that we saw the war against communism, an intellectual battle in which we need to get the upper hand by demonstrating the moral bankruptcy of the other side. A good example, the SEAL Team 6 brought back the equivalent of a small college library from Osama bin Laden's hideout in Abbottabad. So far, the United States government has released 17 documents in 3 years from that small college library. Somehow I have a feeling there's more information in there that could be very useful in painting a real picture of Al-Qaeda, a real picture of the Afghan Taliban, a real picture of Lashkar-e-Taiba, a real picture of Pakistan Taliban, and we're sitting on it. We need to be more aggressive in trying to fight the war of ideas against extremist violence. The intelligence community of the United States, the intelligence communities of our allies in the Islamic world ought to be put into the business of leading that fight.
I'll be brief, Tammy, because I know you're anxious to kick us out and let people get to their lunch, but I think it was an interesting and useful discussion. It really, with all the different elements, I think gives a good sense of the challenges that we feel we're grappling with as we look at it from Washington. We approach the region with a certain degree of humility. We realize it's incredibly complicated, that our ability to affect events exists but is limited. We want to defer to the people of the region. As somebody suggested, we need to let the people of the region take the lead, but then at the same time we find ourselves either just pick up different things that are mentioned, the Sunni-Shia split and deep divisions within Egypt and people actually fighting each other in Syria and intra-GCC divisions. So it's not so simple to say, well, America should just let the region deal with its own affairs, and that's why on that point at least I do agree with Hisham. Only the United States can play a certain role. We may not be sufficient to deal with these problems, that's clear, but sometimes we're necessary. And we realize that, and I think that was one of the things the President wanted to underscore, even as he underscores that we're aware of the limits and constraints of our power, and that the public may not be enthusiastic about it. We know we have a responsibility, and therefore we'll continue, to the extent we can, to pursue not just our interests, but our values, when and where we think we can make a difference. That's the complexity we face, it's the challenge we face. That was true when I was here in 2004. It's true now. If you invite me back in 2024, I suspect it'll continue to be the case.
Phil, thank you, and I'll say right now we'd be happy to have you back in 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, you will find lunch waiting for you down the hall, but before you leave, I hope you will join me in agreement that this was a fantastic and very rich discussion and kickoff to our plenary sessions, and please join me in thanking all of our wonderful panelists.